Deep within the Citadel of Titan, inside the fortress-monastery of the Grey Knights, past corridors that 1,000 years of psyker-warriors have walked in silence, there is a chamber called the Chamber of Purity. The room is said to hold the tomb of Malcador the Sigillite himself, the Emperor's closest advisor, the architect of the Inquisition, the founder of the Grey Knights, the most powerful human psyker in the galaxy after the Emperor, and possibly Magnus the Red. He died sitting on the golden throne in the Emperor's place, buying the hours needed for the final battle against Horus. His tomb, according to lore, rests in that room. Near the tomb sits a simple wooden box, embellished with a golden seal. The seal matches exactly one other object in the entire Imperium of Man. Not a chapter banner, not an Inquisitorial mark, not any symbol from the High Lords or the Adeptus Terra. The only other place that seal appears is on the Emperor's golden throne itself. One soul in the entire galaxy knows how to open the box: the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights. In the current era of 40k lore, that is Kaldor Drygo. No record of the box or its contents exists in any library in the Imperium. Not one entry in the Administratum's billions of categorized documents. Not one mention in the Inquisition's vaults. The High Lords of Terra don't know it exists. The Supreme Grand Master will open it only when all hope for the future of humanity seems lost. That box contains the Terminus decree. For 14 years, from its first appearance in the 5th edition Grey Knights Codex in 2011 to its full reveal in the 10th edition Codex in July 2025, the decree was the most tantalizing sealed mystery in Warhammer 40k lore. The 7th edition Codex described it as a secret so great that it could destroy the foundations of the Imperium, or provide salvation in its darkest hour. Every edition maintained the same fundamental posture: something ancient, something sealed, something the entire Imperium rests on not knowing. When the 10th edition Codex finally opened the box, what it contained split the fanbase immediately. Because the decree, as written, contains a mandate and nothing else. Here is the full canonical text, confirmed across multiple independent sources referencing the 10th edition Codex. The Master of Mankind can never be allowed to leave the Golden Throne, either return to life, reborn in another's body, or ascend as some kind of warp entity. Should that somehow occur, the Grey Knights must return him to his terrible duty. That is the mandate: return him to the throne. All hope for humanity, sealed in a wooden box, reduced to 6 sentences of instruction. And the same codex confirms, in a passage cited consistently across fan analysis and the Lexicanum entry both, the decree offers no guidance on how such feats may be achieved, for it's neither a weapon nor a magic formula. No weapon, no formula, no mechanism whatsoever. An order with no means of execution, addressed to approximately 1,183 Space Marine psychers on a moon of Saturn, requiring them to confront and physically compel back onto his seat a being described across multiple canonical sources as the most powerful psyker in all of human history. A man whose psychic presence has saturated the immaterium for 10,000 years, whose consciousness reaches across 1,000,000 worlds, who bends space and time as an expression of his will. The Terminus decree tells the Grey Knights what must be done. It says absolutely nothing about how. That gap isn't an accident. Everything that follows is an argument for why. The Emperor and Malcador didn't build incomplete things. Their entire legacy is a study in layered contingency. Each failsafe designed with a mechanism. Each mechanism designed with a backup. The Grey Knights themselves are evidence of this. Founded at the height of the Horus heresy, hidden from the traitors besieging Terra, transported to Titan through a webway portal by Malcador himself before the Sol system was locked down, the chapter was built in complete secrecy from 8 Space Marine psychers who severed all ties to their original legions. Malcador wrapped Titan in a psychic ward and sent the entire moon into the warp to ride out the siege while the chapter grew inside it. When Titan returned to real space, a full 1,000 Grey Knights emerged, trained, equipped, prepared. That isn't improvisation. That is planning on a scale that makes most Imperial strategists look like children drawing maps in the dirt. The Icaros contingency shows what a complete Malcador-era operational protocol looks like. Issued only to Lionel Johnson and the First Legion, it was a sealed directive authorizing the Dark Angels to conduct preemptive combat operations against elements of the Mechanicum if those elements became contrary to the needs of the Imperium. Classified to the point of near invisibility in official records, but structurally complete. A named threat, a named executor, a defined authority clause, and an operational mechanism. It worked because it was built to work. The Terminus decree names the threat, the Emperor leaving the throne in any of 3 specified forms. It names the executor, the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights. It defines the outcome, return him to his terrible duty. The mechanism is absent from the document. The mechanism is absent because it can't be written in the document. Writing the mechanism down would expose the asset, and the asset, by its very nature, can't be exposed. Before the property mapping begins, 3 minutes of shared vocabulary, the dictionary the rest of the argument depends on. A blank, also known as an untouchable, a pariah, or a psychic null, is an exceedingly rare strain of human mutant. The Lexicanum defines the condition precisely. A blank has no presence in the warp whatsoever. Where every other living creature, psyker or mundane, casts at minimum a faint shadow in the immaterium, a blank casts nothing. No reflection, no disturbance, no trace. The Lexicanum describes the field this creates as a psychically inert region, where it's impossible for psychic powers or entities native to the immaterium to penetrate or affect that space. The physical experience of proximity to a blank is documented across the lore. Psykers find their abilities suppressed or severed. Demons can't function within the null field's radius. Even non-psychic humans feel something, a cold wrongness, a revulsion that the conscious mind can't entirely account for, an instinct older than language that something is fundamentally absent where a soul should be. The blank themselves are often described as moving through crowds that part around them without knowing why. The Imperial Psychic Measurement Scale, the assignment as it is called in the Lexicanum, runs across a 24-point range. Pariah grades occupy the negative extreme. Normal humans sit around the neutral midpoint. Alpha plus psykers occupy the positive extreme. The Emperor exists beyond the positive extreme, above the upper bound of the scale itself, exceeding the maximum measurement Imperial authorities have any means to assign. Blanks exist at the opposite pole, below the floor of the scale, a category of absence rather than a low reading. Primarchs aren't anywhere near that floor. Every Primarch is warp-touched by design. The Emperor visited a warp gate on the night world of Molech and struck a bargain with the Chaos Gods to receive the knowledge required to create them. The creation process combined arcane genetic science with the energies of the warp from the first moment of gestation. The Fandom Wiki's Emperor of Mankind article describes this explicitly. Before the Primarch capsules were even complete, the Chaos Gods reached through the warp and scattered them across the galaxy. Proof that the Primarchs registered as significant presences in the Immaterium from the moment of their conception. They are, as one passage in the lore frames it, warp entities wrapped in human flesh. That is the paradox the Null Primarch theory proposes. A being created through warp-infused processes, by definition in possession of a warp soul, who somehow has no warp presence at all. The 2nd and 11th Legions were both expunged from all Imperial records during the Great Crusade. The Lexicanum records the fact plainly. Both lost legions are said to have been expunged from Imperial records for good reason. Whether the 2nd or the 11th is the candidate matters less than the properties. The numbering debate gets one sentence here and no more. The theory is established. The vocabulary is shared. What hasn't been done formally is using the decree itself as the evidence. Every known property of that wooden box mapped against the specific requirements of deploying a null entity against the Emperor on the Golden Throne. Property by property, nail by nail, starting with the property most easily dismissed and actually most revealing. The Terminus decree goes unrecorded in all the libraries of the Imperium. The fandom wiki's entry on the decree states this directly. It goes unrecorded in all the libraries of the Imperium, kept secret from all but the Supreme Grand Masters of the chapter. The 5th edition Codex established the same principle at first publication in 2011. This isn't classification, it's non-existence in the institutional record. The distinction between classified and non-existent is meaningful. A classified document is hidden from most people, while remaining accessible to those with sufficient authority. The Icaros contingency was classified. The Inquisition's files on Grey Knight operations are classified. The contents of the custodian's oaths are classified. These things exist in records that could, theoretically, be accessed by someone with the right credentials and the right circumstances. Classification is concealment within a system. The Terminus decree isn't in the system at all. No administratum logician has a file reference for it. No inquisitorial database holds even an entry acknowledging such a protocol exists. The document has been maintained in a single location, the Chamber of Purity on Titan, for the full 10,000 years of the 40K era, accessible to exactly one person at any given time. A bomb doesn't require that level of erasure. A weapon in an armory is classified, not absent from all records. A sealed order to a Space Marine chapter is classified, not non-existent. Even the most sensitive strategic assets the Imperium possesses exist somewhere in some record. What would require genuine non-existence is an asset that could be detected through the record's existence itself, not by a spy reading a file, by an entity perceiving the record's contents through means other than physical access. The Emperor's psychic reach, as documented across multiple lore sources, isn't limited to physical proximity. His consciousness, even chained to the Golden Throne, extends across the galaxy. He perceives through the warp. He has sat at the focal point of the immaterium for 10,000 years, burning through psykers to maintain the Astronomicon. His awareness is of a fundamentally different order than any human intelligence. Hiding something from the Emperor requires hiding it from the warp itself, because that is where he perceives. A null entity has zero warp presence. The lexicanum's definition is absolute. It's impossible for psychic powers or entities native to the immaterium to penetrate or affect the space a blank creates. A null entity can't be perceived through psychic means. It generates no signal in the immaterium. It can't be sensed by the being the decree is designed to address. If the weapon the decree deploys were a conventional entity, a person with a warp presence, a demon bound to a blade, a fleet of ships with psyker crews, the Emperor could, in principle, detect it, not through espionage, through the warp. The asset would register. It would cast a shadow in the immaterium. The decree's erasure from all records isn't just institutional caution. It's the document side of a two-part concealment. The document hides the deployment order from human knowledge. The asset's nature hides the asset itself from psychic knowledge. Together, they create something genuinely invisible to the target, a contingency whose existence can be neither read nor felt. A conventional weapon needs only the first half. A living null entity at primarch-scale needs both. Because without the erased records, its deployment order would itself be a signal that something extraordinary existed. And without its null nature, its physical existence would be perceptible to the Emperor through the immaterium. The golden seal on the box isn't decorative. That seal appears only one other place, the Emperor's Golden Throne. It's a signature, a mark that identifies the authority behind the order, that links the deployment mechanism to the object it's designed to address. Written by someone who had direct knowledge of what the throne contains. Sealed so that the throne's occupant could never read it. Property 2 is the strangest. and it's the one that generates the most immediate friction when the decree is read against the Grey Knight's capabilities. The Grey Knights are designated Chapter 666. Their founding 8, Janus, Koios, Iapto, Satre, Epimetheus, Jotun, Ogun, and Chiron, were all Space Marine psykers, selected by Malcador personally, stripped of their prior Legion identities, and given new names drawn from the Titans of Terran mythology. Every single member of the chapter is a psyker. In 10,000 years of operation, no Grey Knight has ever been corrupted by chaos. Their psychic conditioning is extraordinary. Their discipline is extraordinary. They are the finest psyker-warriors the Imperium has ever produced. They are also spectacularly, specifically unsuited to operating alongside a null entity in any conventional operational sense. A blank's null field suppresses psychic ability through proximity. The suppression is mechanical, an intrinsic property of the null field itself, not a directed attack. A blank standing next to a Grey Knight does not distinguish between enemy psykers and allied ones. The Lexicanum's entry on blanks and the fandom wiki both confirm that the psychic inertia a blank creates affects all psychic activity in their vicinity. An all-psyker chapter operating alongside a null primarch would, in raw operational terms, be reduced to well-armored but non-psychic Space Marines the moment they entered effective null field range. Their primary capability, the entire distinguishing feature that makes the Grey Knights what they are, would be suppressed by the asset they are charged to deploy. The custodians weren't given the decree. The lore states explicitly why. The Emperor determined that the custodians lacked sufficient free will. They are built to obey. Their entire nature is shaped around absolute loyalty to the Master of Mankind. The Terminus decree might require acting against the Master of Mankind, opposing a resurrected Emperor, physically restraining an Emperor reborn in another body, confronting an Emperor ascending as a warp entity and forcing him back onto a machine he has left. One analysis of the Codex text frames it precisely. It's the one thing the custodians could never do themselves, the paradoxical embodiment of their one and only deficiency. A custodian is constitutionally incapable of contradicting the Emperor's apparent will. The decree requires executors who can. The Sisters of Silence weren't given it either. This detail demands attention. If the goal were simply to deploy anti-psychic capability, warriors with the pariah gene who could suppress warp activity, the Sisters of Silence already exist in that role. They served alongside the Emperor during the Great Crusade. They participated in the Webway War. They are the Imperium's institutionalized blank warriors. If the decree activated a force of human-level blanks, the Sisters of Silence are the canonical answer to that question. They weren't entrusted with the activation order. Their existence actually sharpens the paradox. The Emperor had human blanks available in an organized, deployable form, and he still gave the decree to a chapter of psykers. The Inquisition wasn't given it. Too large, too politically complex, too prone to internal fracture. A singular secret can't survive institutional entropy at inquisitorial scale. The Grey Knights were given it. The resolution to this paradox runs through the one thing the Grey Knights possess that no other institution matches: psychic conditioning so deep and so rigorously maintained that it has held against the full force of chaos for 10,000 years without a single confirmed failure. Their mental architecture is built to resist forces that would destroy lesser minds. If any psyker-warriors in the Imperium could function in proximity to a null primarch, not comfortably, not without strain, but operationally, maintaining enough discipline and physical capability to execute a mission even as their psychic abilities are suppressed, it would be warriors with this specific training profile. The Grey Knights are also the institutional heirs of Malcador himself. They were built from his organization, trained by his chosen 8, founded in the chamber that holds his tomb, maintained across 10 millennia as the operational arm of the contingency he and the Emperor constructed together. The decree lives in the same room as Malcador's resting place. The chapter that holds it was built by the same architect. These aren't incidental custodians. They were designed from the beginning to hold this specific activation order, an order for a mission that requires them to suppress their primary capability and function as something else entirely when the moment comes. Now to the elimination round. Walk through the available options systematically, starting with the most straightforward physical approach. A Space Marine assault, even a Grey Knight's assault, against the Emperor on the Golden Throne requires getting through the Adeptus Custodes. 10,000 warriors, each described in lore as superior to standard Space Marines, guard the approaches to the throne. The Grey Knights number approximately 1,183 Astartes at full strength in 999 M41. A frontal assault on the Imperial Palace by fewer than 1,200 warriors against 10,000 Custodes and the layered defenses of the most fortified structure in the galaxy does not end with anyone reaching the throne. It ends with the Grey Knights destroyed somewhere between the outer walls and the inner sanctum. This calculation does not yet involve the Emperor himself. The lore is unambiguous about what confronting the Emperor means for a psyker. Described across canonical sources as capable of crushing stars with his telekinetic force and dominating the minds of 100,000 warriors simultaneously, his psychic grade exceeds the upper bound of the Imperium's own 24-point measurement scale. The Golden Throne is a massive psychic engine channeling his consciousness across the galaxy and generating the Astronomicon. Its emanations alone, separate from any active defense, create an environment hostile to psychic entities. A psyker sensitive enough to perceive the warp may find mere proximity to the throne intolerable. Any direct psychic attack from the Grey Knights against the Emperor would be like aiming a candle at a star. They can't outmatch what sits on that throne, not collectively, not even close. A demon weapon or warp entity brought into the Emperor's presence fails immediately. He is called the anathema by the Chaos Gods because his nature in the immaterium is the antithesis of chaos. His presence actively unravels warp entities without deliberate effort on his part. A warp-based weapon brought before him is destroyed by the environment he creates. A conventional physical weapon, a blade, a melta-charge, anything that doesn't require psychic delivery, still requires delivery. Getting it close enough to the Emperor to use requires approaching him. Approaching him means entering the perceptual field of a being who perceives the warp at galactic scale. Any entity with a warp presence, and all conventional warriors, all psykers, even ordinary humans cast some trace in the immaterium, would register to the Emperor before reaching melee range. The lore describes him as capable of channeling his power toward intruders, of defending himself actively from the throne. Physical approach by any warp-present entity is psychically visible to the entity being approached. A null entity is invisible by definition. A blank has no warp presence. The psychic mechanisms that would detect, target, and destroy any other approaching entity operate through the immaterium. They require a signature to locate. A being with zero warp signature provides no target for those defenses. It approaches through the physical world without leaving any trace in the world the Emperor primarily perceives. The novel Master of Mankind contains a specific observation about how blanks interact with the Emperor. Since they have no soul to speak of, none of his psychic glamours and illusions function against them. They perceive him as he truly is. That passage is about perception, but the principle extends in both directions. The same mechanisms that allow the Emperor to project psychic dominance, to inspire awe, to manipulate and deceive through warp-based means, those mechanisms find no purchase on a being with no warp presence to act upon. A null entity doesn't merely resist the Emperor's psychic influence. It exists outside the medium through which that influence operates. A primarch-level null entity would carry this property at primarch-scale. The null field of an ordinary human blank, a Sister of Silence, a Calexis assassin, operates at human intensity. The Sisters of Silence are formidable, but they are human-scale blanks. Every Primarch exists above human scale, in every measurable dimension. A Null Primarch's Null field would operate at the tier of Primarch physical and metaphysical capability, far beyond what any human blank can generate. There is a genuine challenge to this argument, and it deserves its full statement before the response. The canonical lore records that Alpha Plus level psykers are so powerful that even blanks, specifically blanks of the level of Sisters of Silence or Calexis assassins, have their resistances to psychic abilities negated by the overwhelming strength of those psykers. If this applies to the Emperor, whose psychic power exceeds Alpha Plus by an enormous and unmeasured margin, then even a Primarch-level Null field might be insufficient protection when approaching the throne. This has real canonical weight. The immunity of ordinary blanks to ordinary psykers is documented. The negation of that immunity at the Alpha Plus extreme is also documented. The Emperor exceeds Alpha Plus. The inference follows. Two facts must be held simultaneously in responding to it. First, the scaling argument preserves the property even if it doesn't guarantee it. The quote references human-level blanks being overwhelmed by Alpha Plus psykers. A Primarch does not sit on the same rung as a human blank. If ordinary blanks can be overwhelmed by Alpha Plus psykers, and the Emperor sits above Alpha Plus, then yes, ordinary blanks may be insufficient. But a Null Primarch, existing at the same tier as other Primarchs in the positive warp presence direction, would sit in a fundamentally different relationship to the Emperor's psychic force than a human blank does. The relative scaling between Primarch tier Null field and the Emperor's psychic force may preserve the property where human tier blank immunity does not. Second, the decree itself is the more decisive argument. It's a live operational protocol maintained across multiple codex editions and 10,000 years of in-universe institutional history, described as the final sanction that will either save mankind or doom it to oblivion. The golden seal on the box matches the golden throne. The document was written by someone with direct knowledge of what the throne contains and what the mission requires. That author specified Grey Knights as the executor, specified return him to his terrible duty as the outcome, and provided no mechanism. If a Null Primarch's approach would also be overwhelmed, if there is genuinely no mechanism that works, then the decree is an order written with full knowledge of its own futility. The Emperor and Malcador didn't write futile contingencies. The Grey Knight's existence proves they didn't. Whatever the mechanism is, the author believed it would work. The elimination of every other candidate from the available options points to the Null entity as the remaining answer, even accounting for the Alpha Plus scaling complication. Deployment protocols describe deployable things. The Terminus decree isn't an archive entry. It has been maintained as the ultimate sanction in present tense across the entire span of the 40K era. From its first appearance in the 5th edition Codex, through the 8th edition, through to the 10th edition reveal, the decree is always described as the final option that will either save humanity or doom it. That is operational language, not commemorative language. An order for a destroyed weapon is a historical footnote. The Grey Knights don't keep historical footnotes in the Chamber of Purity on Titan in a box whose seal matches the Emperor's throne, accessible only to the Supreme Grand Master. The decree is sealed because its activation is still possible. It's possible because what it activates still exists. The language applied to the lost Primarchs reinforces this from a different direction. The Lexicanum records the relevant passage directly. Both lost legions are said to have been expunged from Imperial records for good reason. Expunged. The traitor Primarchs weren't expunged. Horus's name was preserved as a warning. Magnus and Lorgar are documented as fallen. The records of the traitor legions serve the function of identifying enemies. The 2nd and 11th Primarchs weren't documented as traitors. Their names were simply removed. The legion numbers persist as blank spaces in the sequence, present absences where a name should be. Argoltal, in Aaron Dembski-Bowden's The First Heretic, references killing the 11th Primarch in a passage the Lexicanum cites, though does not reproduce in full. The language of certain records suggests death, but expunged from records isn't the same as confirmed destroyed. The Imperium marks execution, it marks traitors, it marks defeats. The deliberate removal of a name from every record is a different act, not documentation of an end, but erasure of an existence. The Emperor who expunged the lost Primarch's records and the Emperor who sealed the Terminus decree was the same being, acting within the same historical window. The pattern between the two acts is identical: deliberate erasure, institutional concealment, no announcement, no documented reason. The expungement hides the asset. The decree seals the activation order. Two sides of the same architecture. Beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, in the dark cells, sometimes called the Black Cells, the Lexicanum describes shadowy oubliettes holding entities and artifacts of old night that could annihilate the Imperium if they were ever to break free. Entities, living presences, not objects. The Imperium possesses a documented institutional precedent for holding things sealed rather than destroyed when those things are too dangerous to acknowledge, but too potentially valuable to terminate. Something kept alive, held in the place the Emperor built, in close proximity to the throne and the mechanism the decree addresses. Now to the core objection, stated fully and fairly, not reduced. Primarchs aren't merely genetically enhanced humans. They are warp entities in human flesh. The Emperor visited the warp gate at Molech and struck a bargain with the Chaos Gods to receive the knowledge required for their construction. The Fandom Wiki's Emperor article describes the process explicitly. The creation of the Primarchs combined techniques of arcane genetic science with the energies of the warp. Before the gestation capsules were complete, the Chaos Gods reached through the warp and scattered them across the galaxy, which required that the Primarchs had sufficient warp presence for the Chaos Gods to perceive and interact with them before birth. This is the canonical foundation. Primarchs have warp souls, their power, their resilience, their capacity for leadership that borders on psychic influence even in non-psyker Primarchs. All of it flows in part from their connection to the immaterium. A blank has no warp soul. The pariah gene, however it functions biologically, produces a state of complete psychic absence. The Lexicanum is precise. Blanks are an exceedingly rare strain of human mutant whose mutation results in no presence in the warp whatsoever. Combining these two conditions, Primarch creation through warp-infused process and blank, total absence of warp presence, produces a logical contradiction. The objection, stated honestly, is that a null Primarch isn't a mystery to be solved. It's a category error. Grant that. Grant that by the normal rules of 40K metaphysics, the conditions that produce a Primarch and the conditions that produce a blank are mutually exclusive. Grant that under standard operating conditions, a null Primarch is impossible. Then turn to the decree. The Terminus decree requires a mechanism capable of approaching the Emperor through his psychic field, surviving proximity to the strongest psyker in human history, and physically compelling a warp-transcendent being back onto the Golden Throne. By the elimination of every other candidate, that mechanism must possess the property of warp immunity, not psychic shielding, not resistance to attack, but the fundamental absence of warp presence that makes psychic attack impossible because there is no target to attack. Either this entity exists, or the decree has no implementation pathway. The Emperor and Malcador didn't write orders with no implementation pathways. If the decree is genuine, and it's confirmed canonical, present in the 5th edition Codex in 2011, and maintained through the 10th, then the mechanism exists. The mechanism must have these properties. The only entity in the lore with these properties is a null entity. A null Primarch is impossible by the standard rules. The Emperor is also the being who visited a warp gate on Molech, struck a bargain with 4 Chaos Gods and used that knowledge to create 20 superhuman demigods from his own genome. He wasn't limited by standard rules. He defined what the rules were. One edge case from lore history adds texture here. Old-era Necron units, called pariah Necrons, since revised out of current canon but present in the game's history, were humans transformed into blank equivalents through Necron biotransference technology. If external technology could impose blank status on a being that normally wouldn't possess it, then the acquisition of null properties through means other than natural mutation is at least narratively precedented within the setting. Whether the Emperor could accomplish something comparable through his own understanding of the warp and of genetics is a different question. But the door to the possibility has been opened by the lore's own history. The deeper structural point completes the argument. The psychic measurement scale has a negative extreme, pariah grades. The Emperor exists beyond the positive extreme, above alpha plus, above the ceiling of the scale. If the positive extreme has a ceiling breaker, the negative extreme may have a floor breaker. A null primarch at that tier wouldn't simply be an unusually powerful blank. It would be the structural counterweight to the Emperor himself, the exact negative of the exact positive, existing beyond the measured lower bound of the assignment, just as the Emperor exists beyond its measured upper bound. The only entity in the galaxy capable of what the decree requires. The Emperor's awareness of his own potential failure is documented in recent lore. At the end of the Siege of Terra, in the final psychic confrontation aboard the Vengeful Spirit, he stood at the edge of what the lore calls the Dark King, the entity he might have become if the warp's accumulated pressure had tipped him over. Recent Black Library material describes him as having verged on becoming the fifth Chaos God. He chose the throne instead. The choice was real, and the cost was real. A body that can't die and can't truly live, sustained by 1,000 psykers sacrificed each day, maintaining a psychic beacon across 1,000,000 worlds. He was also a planner across timescales that dwarf individual human lifetimes. He had been alive since at least the Age of Strife. He had guided human history for tens of thousands of years. He built the Primarchs over a project spanning the entire unification period. He didn't choose the throne and simply trust that the choice would hold forever. The Golden Throne is a machine, and machines fail over 10,000 years. The requirement for psyker sacrifice has grown as the throne has degraded. The technical knowledge to maintain it was built in the dark age of technology and is now largely lost. If the throne fails, if a resurrection is forced by external intervention, if an ascension is driven by the sheer accumulated psychic weight of 10 millennia of human worship, the Emperor may not have the ability to choose to remain on it. The departure might not be a choice. He wrote a contingency for that. He created something that shouldn't be possible, a being of primarch-scale physical power with no warp presence whatsoever, a being invisible to the most comprehensive psychic awareness in human history, a being that can walk through the psychic fire of the Golden Throne's emanations untouched because it generates no signal for that fire to catch, a being specifically and uniquely suited to the one task no other force in the galaxy can accomplish. Physically approaching the Emperor when he is off the throne and returning him to it. He hid this being. He erased the record of its existence from every Imperial database. He sealed the deployment order in the Chamber of Purity on Titan, in the room where the man who helped him build the contingency is said to rest. He marked the activation order with the same seal as the throne itself, a signature, a connection, a mark of authorship, linking the two objects across the entirety of human space. He gave the key to the 666th chapter of Space Marines. Psykers every one. Incorruptible. Secret. Built by the same architect who built the contingency. Maintained across 100 centuries without a single confirmed failure of loyalty. Capable, in their unique psychic conditioning, of functioning alongside an asset that would suppress everything that makes them what they are. reduced to their physical capabilities alone, which are still considerable, while the weapon they escort does what no weapon was ever supposed to be able to do. Every property of the decree points at the same solution: the sealing, the singularity, the golden seal matching the throne. The all-psyker chapter handed deployment authority for an anti-psyker asset. The approach through an environment that destroys everything with a warp presence. The active operational status of a contingency that only makes sense if its payload is still alive and accessible. The erasure of a primarch's name from every record using concealment language rather than execution language. The dark cells beneath the palace holding entities alive rather than destroyed. Each property eliminates every alternative and points at the same gap in the lore. The Terminus decree doesn't describe a weapon. It describes a mercy. The Emperor of mankind, God on the throne, architect of a million worlds, the being the chaos gods themselves call the anathema, looked into the future and saw the possibility of his own failure. He saw what he might become. He saw the Dark King waiting in the space between his continued endurance and his breaking. And rather than accept that future, he built something impossible. His own kill switch, his own executioner, his own exit from the universe he has sustained for 10,000 years. A being designed to walk through the psychic fire of the most powerful mind in human history, untouched, because it has no soul for that fire to catch. Sealed beneath his palace, activated by the most secretive warriors in the Imperium, available when all hope seems lost, and the only remaining option is the Emperor himself. That is what the wooden box contains. A being that shouldn't exist, built by the only entity capable of creating something impossible, maintained in silence for 10,000 years, waiting in the dark beneath the palace for the day the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights finally opens the box and reads the 6 sentences aloud. His last gift to humanity, a way out of the Emperor himself. If this argument gave the theory sharper edges than it had before, if the property-by-property mapping snaps something into focus, subscribe for more.